So, with the Black Lives Matter rally that have been going on since the shootings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and of course Jacob Blake, and the list goes on. And with the Hong Kong protests that have been going on over the past uh, months because of a so-called extradition bill because of a murder case of a Chinese national murdered his girlfriend in Taiwan. So one thing that really is a question is that who are really the heroes or the terrorists in this one? Well, of course, is that Mr. President Donald Trump has been branding peaceful protests across the US cities as violent terrorist rioters, while it's the police themselves who are attacking the peaceful protesters who police themselves are violent while the ralliers are not. In Hong Kong, what has been going on over the past year, it's been the other way around. And we obviously know that like it's based from some footages, it is the so-called pro democracy protesters that have been on the violent side, while it's the Hong Kong police, in spite being trained by US or being supplied by US, the anti-rioting weapons, who are defending themselves. And so, uh, one thing that we one thing we have to analyze is, has Chinese democratic movements really been about democracy? Have they always been about the constitutional human rights? Well, we have to look at like what happened in Tiananmen Square in '89. It seems like the protest was about democracy, but if you actually really look at it, it was about like a power grab among student leaders. Well, yeah, it was a democracy movement, but inside within the student leaders, it wasn't really about democracy, but it was about a power grab from the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party. And they really didn't want to overthrow the Communist Party. They wanted to take over the Communist Party. And a blogger named Tovarisch Endymion does a good analysis, which I will send the link below, his view about the student leaders in Tiananmen Square. And a famous documentary called The Gate of Heavenly Peace also tackles about the controversial side of the students, not the Chinese government. And I like the videos about the Hong Kong protesters, though I don't trust the state-run the media, though I like how China Southern Posts debunk a question that debunked the statement from President Trump that Hong Kong rioters are the heroes while the Black Lives Matter ralliers are the terrorists. So I like the Shenzhen Canadian businessman-based blogger Daniel Dumbrill, how he does a video debunking some of the statements of the so-called freedom fighters. So, according to according to most sites or mainstream sites, Hong Kong ranks number 3 of the freest countries in the world, behind New Zealand and Switzerland, which I'll also send to the link below after this. So, one of the things that astonishes me is so imagine, this is why I am against Trump and his intervention in Hong Kong. Is that like, so imagine how Trump would be reacting if the Hawaii secessionists or Puerto Rico secessionists or California secessionists met with Beijing officials Imagine how FBI and CIA would react if uh, China infiltrated like anti-fascist groups or uh, Black Lives Matter organizers. Imagine how they would be red tagged. So once again, my stand is that like no matter what, I am against what the so-called pro-democracy protesters are doing, and that also goes for the same with the pro-Beijing protesters, whether they're waving U.S. flags or Chinese flags. They're not really fighting for a genuine democracy. Rather, they're fighting for a particular agenda that uh, they want foreign countries to further their own interests or further expand their interests rather than for a real, genuine, self administrative government. I was astonished after I really found out that were student leaders at Tiananmen Square really about really fighting for freedom. So in part, I was reading about Chai Ling, the female student leader in the Tiananmen Square protests, and I it was astonishing how she would allow the army to slaughter blood among the students so that it's one of her agendas to grab on to power. She wanted the power and she lied to the people who she was leading. And going forward, Joshua Wong, one of the icons in the so-called pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, he himself has never condemned the violence and aggression that was committed by his side, and he himself has glorified the violence against the police. And I was watching even Western mainstream news, corporate-owned media, went to some campuses of the pro-democracy camp, and they were practicing throwing Molotov cocktails and firing arrows as one of their staged next assault against police. So yeah, so much for a so-called pro-democracy protests. So I'm not even supporting the Hong Kong protests. I think that like it should be resolved amongst themselves, which I think the I agree with some people from the left and the right that protests should not be in comparison with the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Jacob Blake protests. Because once again, I will say this again: the Hong Kong rioters are the violent aggressors, and the police are the ones defending themselves. While halfway around the world here in the U.S., the police are the violent aggressors, while the peaceful protesters are the ones who are interacting in with non-violent perspective. While it's still the same with how the police handle the protesters, like knee on the neck, I can breathe kind of thing. So one of the thing is that like I agree if they both have the same agenda, both the countries.